Give it up big for the founder and executive chairman of the American Conservation Coalition, Benji Backer, and the co-founder of the Cool Down, Anna Robertson, everybody. Go get them. Go get them. And BFFs.
Yeah, we're new BFFs in the climate space. We had dinner the other night, and that gave me hope, having dinner with one of the leading conservative environmentalists and Raleigh. So, well, thanks for being here, everybody. As Raleigh said, I'm Anna Robertson. I'm the co-founder of the Cool Down and a proud member of the Mountain Towns 2030 board as well. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Cool Down, we are the largest mainstream climate brand. We reach about 30 million people a month, and we really focus on innovation and stories of hope, and also practical ways that real people can actually live healthier lives, save money, and make better choices for the planet. And part of our mission at the Cool Down has been to build a bigger tent around climate and bring more people into the conversation, including conservatives, because in the climate space, as we all know, there's a lot of people talking to one another, and the only way that we expand this movement is if we invite more people into the conversation. And that's where Benji comes in. We've known each other for the last several years, and Benji is, as Raleigh said, the founder and executive chairman of the American Conservation Coalition, which is the largest right-of-center youth environmental organization. And he's also the author of The Conservative Environmentalist, which really provides kind of a roadmap to bridging a divide, right? The book really rejects what he calls the false choice between alarmism and denialism, and argues that conservative principles are a key to realistic climate solutions. And he's really become one of the leading voices for civility and conversation, collaboration over division, and the idea that protecting the environment should be a nonpartisan principle. So I'm excited to have Benji here, especially given that many of our mountain towns exist within red states, right? And we need to figure out how to find collaboration and consensus. So you write in your book, eyebrows always raise when I tell people I'm a conservative environmentalist, but the reality is there are many of us. And I think especially in this election cycle with the extreme weather we've been seeing and the real effects of climate change playing out in real time, we're seeing more interest than ever before. So you've been traveling the country and meeting with all kinds of people. What do you think would surprise people about what you're hearing?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I know, having a conservative environmentalist on stage is not always the most comfortable thing in the world, so I appreciate that. Actually, a perfect example of this was yesterday. I was on a hike in the Tetons, and at the end of the hike, I ran into somebody, and he lived here, and he was like asking me why I was here because I was alone, and I was like, well, I'm on this book tour right now, and he's like, what's your book called? And I said, The Conservative Environmentalist, and you could just see him, he's like, The what? What is that? And I have no idea what side of the spectrum he was on. He could have been liberal and was like, a conservative can be an environmentalist, or a conservative, and he was like, an environmentalist who's conservative. That's really why it's titled that, because it's, the whole point is to bridge the divide and start to shape the narrative. But, I think what I've really come to the realization in the last 8 years is that we will never solve any challenges environmentally or with climate if it continues to be partisan. And I truly believe that the environment and nature should be a nonpartisan issue. I've always felt that way. I'm a lifelong conservative, but I don't care about political ideology when I'm out in nature. And the first time I felt frustrated by this was here in the Tetons. I was on a backpacking trip after I graduated high school. I grew up in Wisconsin. And most of the time when I'm in nature, I'm decompressing and resetting like we all want to do. But this time it was in the middle of the 2016 election, and I just couldn't get the 2016 election off my mind, which is a pretty toxic thought process. And I was sitting in the mountains thinking about how politicized they became and how frustrating that was, right? Like we are all sharing these resources, we're all sharing nature, we're all sharing this planet, and yet we don't think about it in terms of that. We think about it in terms of partisan affiliation. And that was when I had kind of the first inclination to start ACC to get conservatives back to the table. Because it didn't used to be this way. I was speaking at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library a few weeks ago. He created the EPA. He signed into law the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. He created NOAA. He funded the first climate assessment in United States history. And I was backstage looking at his campaign booklet, which was 80 pages long. I don't think anybody running for office could have an 80-page long booklet now. But the last thing in the book was the environment. And I asked the team there, I was like, why is this last? He prioritized it a ton. And they said, because at the time, it was just an expectation that you led on it. You didn't have to debate whether or not you were going to do something about it because America wanted you to do it. And it was across party lines. Over 80% of Americans self-identified as environmentalists during that time. That number is only 38% today. So we have a real challenge ahead of us. And the reality is that we can't solve environmental challenges without conservatives, and conservatives have to be at the table, and that's what I'm dedicating my life to solve.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And for anybody who isn't familiar with ACC's work, they lobby a lot of conservative leaders around climate issues to make sure that they're talking about them and thinking about them. And mobilize young people, the next generation who really cares about these issues. Let's talk a little bit about language, because I know that's become a real passion point for you, and something we were talking about at dinner the other night, just the importance and sort of the triggers around some of the language and what you're doing next in creating a nonprofit that can hopefully sort of think about both language and the messengers that deliver the climate message to, be more effective in communicating.
Well, unfortunately, so many words these days have been weaponized, and both sides. I mean, I was explaining the words that I'm going to go into in a second, and they were like, well, that's just the right, associating those words with bad things when that's actually not true. I'm like, well, the left does it too. I would consider myself, and don't get super triggered by this, but I would consider myself America first, because I do believe in America and our priorities. But when you say that now, of course, it makes you think of something that's not necessarily great. So that's kind of how some of these words within environmentalism have been associated with on the right. And so you have words like climate change and environmentalism that, I'm telling you, when I talk to conservatives, because I've been on this book tour going around the country, but I also have spent so many days in every state in this country trying to meet with people on the ground. When you say you're like a climate change activist, the thing they think of is, if they're on the right, is something that they just completely disagree with. It's ideas that are against their values. It's not that they don't care about the environment. And in fact, I was speaking at Boulder last week, at CU Boulder, and there's actually a climate denier in the audience, which I was not expecting. I expect climate deniers at certain events, but not at CU Boulder. And so I was a little shocked when they asked this question, but it kind of paints the picture. She goes, I care so deeply about the environment. I care about clean air, clean water. I care about being in the mountains. I would fight to the death to protect the environment, but I don't believe in climate change. And it wasn't because she didn't care about the environment or the planet. It's because she associates climate change with a policy agenda that's going to take away her livelihood or take away America's greatness or whatever it is. There's a fear that the policies are going to dictate. And to show that it's a language game, that's one anecdote, but it's also the fact that there's studies that back this up. Duke University did a study in 2014 that showed that 40% of Republicans at the time believed in climate change. But when they were given a alternative policy proposal that fit their values, it jumped to over 80%. So the words climate change, the word environmentalism, obviously, or environmentalist, which I use in the title, and I go totally against my own advice in doing that. But there are certain words that evoke a really negative reaction, and it's not that people don't care about these topics, it's that they associate them with things they don't like. And the words that really work for conservatives tend to be the more local-minded words. And so like nature, environment itself, like the word environment, conservation, stewardship, those are words that conservatives can really rally behind. And similar to indigenous tribes, I've found the same kind of amazing connection to the land in rural communities that conservatives have. And they actually depend on it for their livelihoods. They're farmers, they're ranchers, they're foresters. They might not care about polar bears or the Arctic. Well, they might care about it, but it's not going to be their top priority. But they care about their local community and their local environment. And if you can localize the issue for them and take it out of the political culture wars, you actually have some of the biggest advocates in the world. I mean, this Boulder denier, which is probably the only one that lives there, imagine if you could get all the people like her who are passionate so deeply about the environment, maybe even more so than some climate activists. Imagine if you could get her to be a part of the team, right? That would be a massive difference maker. And all you have to do is use slightly different language. And you can talk about other things, like how America being a part of this dialogue is going to help our national security. Or you can talk about how it's going to create good jobs in the United States that we're right now exporting overseas because we're caught up in political debate on whether or not windmills are causing cancer, and other countries are building windmills and sending us all the materials, right? So like, there's other ways to talk about it, and also just the community development side. Like, we need sustainable agriculture so that farmers can make more money. Like, there's so many ways to talk about this that can get those sorts of people engaged, and it's truly a language game. It's not a, you don't have to convince people to care about the environment. Most people are already there, and they just associate some of these words with negative things.
Yeah, it's such an unlock because we need to get rid of the polar bears and the green leaves and just make it normal, you know, and relate to people and meet them where they are.
And I think it's like make environmentalism about people's environments again, right? Like, that's kind of where I feel like there's the disconnect. Before people, like my grandma, who's 93 years old, I threw a Packers party with her on Sunday. She still has Tupperware. She has margarine containers from the 1980s. And I'm like, this is disgusting. The microplastics.
She's an OG climate hero.
She's an OG climate hero, but she does it because she doesn't want to add trash to the landfills.
Exactly.
And she is the most efficient user of like not being a consumerist, if that's a word, that I've ever met.
Yeah.
And yet she's a lifelong conservative person who now believes in climate change because her grandson is fighting for it, so she has to. But she didn't before. So, you know, there's a lot of people out there that really care about this stuff that we can tap into, and they just maybe care about it for different reasons.
Yeah. You talk about, you know, making the language local. Let's talk about some of the local solutions, because in the book, you talk about, you know, sometimes things don't get done, you know, at the federal level, but they're getting done at the local level. So what are some examples that you want to share of some areas where, you know, the divide has been bridged at a local level to where you're seeing real impact?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, it's just worth addressing that like the inmates are running the asylum in DC right now. You know, we've got MTG and AOC battling it out for competition of attention, and that's not really conducive to solving problems. So, you know, there's a chance to solve things there, and I don't want to like diminish that. But the reality is local action and state action tends to be more quick and more effective, also partially because each state and locality, as everyone knows in this room, has different realities than one another. You know, I lived in Seattle and for 6 years, and the realities there are just, you know, strikingly different than where I live now, which is Arizona. And people are like, wow, you really overcorrected when you got sick of the rain, and I'm like, yeah, I definitely did. But there's endless sun in Arizona, right? And that's part of the problem. But you know, solar is very effective there. Solar in Seattle is not that effective, but there's a lot of hydropower. And I think that's just one example, but every locality has different realities than the next. When Congress tries to pass a law and kind of put something on everybody, that's maybe not as effective because not everyone's dealing with the same realities. Like a farmer who is creating the food that we eat every day might not be able to, you know, buy an electric car in the same way that somebody in Scottsdale, Arizona, where I live, is able to do. And so I think just having the more local, state-based action allows for more effective action. And you're seeing that even in red states. So Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, he doesn't talk about these issues in terms of climate change. But I've been in rooms with Democrats in Georgia who will say that they dislike Brian Kemp on every issue but the environment and energy because he's working across the aisle on this topic. And I mean, all the EV manufacturing is going into the state. There's tons of solar and wind. There's next generation nuclear. There's just so much happening in that state. And it's because he wants to do it for the state and that the state is going to benefit from it and that they want the clean air, clean water, but they also want the jobs and the community development. Same thing with Wyoming. Mark Gordon, who I'm speaking at an event with tomorrow, he is working across the aisle too to say, if you want to build, a wind facility, I think the biggest in the United States is going to be built here in the state of Wyoming. You can do it here. If you want to do solar, you can do it here. If you want to try out carbon capture, do it here. If you want to do, more efficient natural gas production, try to do it here. And if, Bill Gates, you want to build your next generation nuclear facility here, do it here. And again, I think that sort of approach is something that each state can do for themselves, each locality can do for themselves, and some of it's based on economics, some of it's based off of geography and weather, but when you take it out of just only the federal government is going to solve this, you can actually get a lot more action than people think.
Yeah. And what advice would you have, I know you said, I think we have some city commissioners in the room, right? What advice would you have, in terms of just getting things done and creating those kind of relationships that can actually make local action happen?
I would just say focus on, come to the reality that maybe not everyone's going to come to the table for the same reason. So, you can get Republicans and conservatives to be active on this issue without talking about climate change. Like I said, there's so many other ways of intersection for people. And, obviously younger generations don't see this as a partisan issue, or that, everyone in my generation believes climate change is real. But while we are waiting for my generation to get into office quickly, we have to deal with the realities that we have right now. So in that context, I have seen some of the most far-right conservatives vote on pro-climate legislation at the federal level because of some other benefit that they have. In Iowa, all the Iowa delegation is for wind energy development because it's working there and because it's helping the state. They lead the nation in terms of percentage of wind energy. I think it's almost 70% of Iowa's energy comes from wind. That's amazing. And they are voting for it because they love the economics of it. They love the fact that they're exporting energy to other states. I mean, there's other reasons to engage. So don't assume that someone can't be on your side because they're not totally bought in on the climate agenda. You can get people to the same table for different reasons. And we write people off all the time, and the right does this too. We just think because somebody doesn't want to come to the table for one reason that they won't come for it for another. And we have to bridge the partisan divide, and the only way to do that is to acknowledge that maybe somebody who votes yes on nuclear or wind or solar or EVs or whatever could be out there for a different reason than just saving the climate, and that's okay. I don't really care why someone votes yes on it. I just want them to frickin' vote yes. So that's what we're trying to solve, and I think that it's way more possible than you'd think.
Yeah, and I think we heard some frustration yesterday around, progress gets made, a bill gets passed, or renewables get permitted, and then immediately a lawsuit, kicks in, or immediately there's appeals, and it can really be so distracting for local government. So, how can we avoid that kind of a dynamic? Because that's just going to slow progress at a time when we really need to move faster than ever.
Yeah, I think it's just getting buy-in early and meeting with these stakeholders early. I think a lot of times, because it's easier to avoid the people who are seemingly against this message, they don't even get met with. And I would suggest one of the reasons why I think this dialogue has been so back and forth like a political football, which is not healthy for future policy, and it's not good for the country or the climate, is because no one's trying to understand why, how to represent the other side of the aisle at this conversation. And the whole point of the two-party system, which is incredibly broken right now, is to represent two different parts of America and have a competition of ideas. That's kind of the dream, right? That's obviously not happening. But when you have only one side dominating the dialogue, then the other side's priorities are not being met. And I think having them as part of the table early on is critical. And I've talked to some of these companies that are investing billions of dollars into red states in terms of climate technologies, and everyone's like, oh yeah, that's so great, they should be so happy. And it's they never actually met with the stakeholders on the ground first. And they're just like, we have money for you. And they're like, okay, that's great, but how does this apply to my individual life? And how, can you guarantee that my state's going to be better off because of it? And they were never part of those kind of early on strategic conversations. So bringing in conservative communities and saying, hey, what are your needs? What are your worries about this? Why are you worried about it? not saying, hey, we're going to put all this policy on you and expect you to like it. And I think that that's something that's been missed, because we've found, we've done a lot of bipartisan dinners in DC with members of Congress, kind of off the record, and there's so many different like stereotypes and wrongful assumptions that these members have, and a lot of times they haven't even talked to one another before, which is remarkable. But when you get in there and you're like, Democrats will ask Republicans, like, why are you so scared of like the IRA? Or vice versa, like, Republicans will ask, like, why are you so fearful of, more American energy and continuing to do natural gas production while the demand is still there? Like, kind of just asking these questions of like, why? Like, trying to get to an understanding of why someone believes what they believe. A lot of the walls break down, and you realize that like, there's a lot more commonality than you'd think. And I think if you're trying to build the bridge to the other side, it's getting them in early, trying to build the coalition before you place a policy on them and just expect them to like it.
Yeah, we need a lot more conversations around the dinner table, in homes and all of that. Let's talk a little bit about just sort of activating communities and how they can be a piece of it. I mean, it's a big reason why we started the cool down, was because anytime we've had to do something hard in human history, we've needed the general public to understand what's happening. And I mean, I see this in my reporting all the time with companies who are just, begging us to tell stories about, that kind of show that consumers want these right. policies, want these things. And you tell a story in your book about how you met with a Republican Congressman, Ryan Costello of Pennsylvania, when you were 16, who was one of the first Republicans to have a pro-stance on climate change. And, he told you that he and his colleagues would consider voting differently on plenty of policies if we just heard from a couple of voters from time to time. And that, a lot of political figures don't hear from their constituents. No. And I think it's a lever that, that this group might need to pull a little more, right, in terms of how do we build coalitions within communities?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So, like, when I met with Ryan Costello, I had just started. I was 18 years old when I started my nonprofit, and I was sitting in class. I was watching the Hillary Clinton Donald Trump debate, and I was like, "Holy crap, I'm screwed. My generation's screwed." No, I was thinking like how it was kind of that same feeling that I had in the Tetons, where I was like, "This should not be a political issue," and both of these people are just on polar extremes from one another, and that's not going to solve this problem. So I tweeted out during class, "Hey, I'm going to start this conservative environmental organization. Will anyone join me?" And that was the start of this organization. People ask, what was your plan? I'm like, I had no plan, and I actually accidentally started a PAC first, and then I shut that down. And we have a PAC again. But it all comes full circle, I guess. But one of the things that made me think about growing like an advocacy organization and a membership base, we have 55,000 members across the country, was this meeting with Ryan Costello, because he was like, yeah, like I would consider voting on this if 2 or 3 voters reached out, but the only voters I hear from are like the Sierra Club type people who are never going to vote for me anyways. And like I know that might be like hard to hear for some people, but it's true. Like, I don't need to assume every member of the Sierra Club's party affiliation, but there is a trend in a certain direction, and no problem. But that's like the NRA going to Nancy Pelosi and asking her to do something and thinking that she'll listen when she knows that person, even if she wanted to be a part of what they were doing, which she obviously wouldn't, like would actually vote for her, which is obviously not going to happen. So I think creating authentic constituencies that actually can reach people in a way that resonates with them, right? So we have 55,000 young people who are conservative-leaning, who care about this issue. And having those people reach out means so much more than if 10 million reached out from the political left to a Republican. And obviously this 55,000 is just beginning. But when we started, there were 2 Republicans in Congress who said climate change is real, we need to do something about it. Now there are 150. That's what happens when you build constituencies and communities in a way that resonates with politicians. That's democracy and our democratic republic in action in the best possible way. And if we're going to build political consensus around this, we need to normalize that the right and the left are both at the table. And that's why in the next 3 months, I'm going to be launching a movement called Nature is Nonpartisan, where we're going to have one conservative for one liberal, influencer, celebrity, politician, board member, everything is being structured that way to normalize that whether you're on the right or the left, that this issue is something for you, that this is something that we need to fight for together, and that if there's one issue that can bring civility and sensibility back to American politics, it's this. But it's not going to happen without conservatives at the table.
Yeah, and I think for anybody who's not familiar with the Conservative Climate Caucus, I mean, that's kind of what you're referring to. It's one of the largest caucuses in the House of Representatives, and the tenet is that climate change is real, and it is caused by human activities, and it has become, I think we've talked about it over the years. It started with a, clandestine group of congressmen who gathered in Utah to talk about these issues in private, and has now become, a public conversation among conservatives every year that at least is having these conversations. Really important. And I think Citizens Climate Lobby as well as ACC are great allies for this room in terms of ACC has branches all across the country, and that's a way to sort of tap into that community and activate. And we are going to open up for questions in a few minutes, so please get your questions ready. But I want to talk about maybe the elephant in the room, which is fossil fuels. You referenced natural gas, and obviously, I attended the Conservative Climate Summit last week, and John Curtis talked about, fossil fuels is the big source of debate, right, between the two sides, between Republicans and Democrats, because the science is pretty much clear that we cannot continue to keep burning fossil fuels in the way that we have and producing the heat-trapping gases that are putting us where we are. And we know that the fossil fuel industry has a record of knowing that this was coming down the pike. So obviously there are a lot of other energy sources in the mix, which is really exciting, and there's some that have not been politicized yet, which is very exciting. But we still need to figure out how to make this transition, how to do it together without vilifying an industry, but at the same time moving quickly to other sources. So how do you? I know you spend a lot of time with the oil and gas industry. You have a perspective on this. I'd love to hear your take.
Thanks for outing me on that. This guy spends
Just
a lot of
him on the
time
hot
with the oil
seat.
and gas industry. I spend a lot of time with every industry.
Every industry, yes, you do. That's true.
I mean, so this might make people uncomfortable, but I'm not anti-fossil fuels. I'm anti-emissions. That's what I'm anti. And this transition's not going to be perfect. And I think that like every 2 steps forward and 1 step back philosophy is helpful. And you look at the fact that fossil fuel demand is expected right now, even with the push for climate action, to increase in the world in the next 5 to 10 years. People would see that and say, we're screwed. I do not see that because A, that's not accounting for new technological development that brings down the cost and increases reliability for renewables. It also doesn't include technological breakthroughs in nuclear fission or fusion or geothermal or any of those things, right? So it doesn't account for that. But it also doesn't account for massive efficiencies and improvements that can happen within fossil fuels while we're still using them. And I think that that's a big area of focus. People just write off fossil fuels. Well, we cannot write off fossil fuels. It's still a big part of our energy mix. And I toured the first net zero of a natural gas production in Colorado last week for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And you might say, okay, well, that's just a Band-Aid for the problem. No, we still use natural gas. So if we're going to use it, we might as well use it as cleanly as we possibly can. And if you reduce emissions by 50% off of existing fossil fuels, you're reducing emissions significantly globally. So I think it's not this easy we just need to ban fossil fuels or get rid of them. It's saying how do we scale these other energy technologies faster, and how do we make existing fossil fuels more efficient and less carbon intensive? Because it's possible. I mean, you can limit flaring, you can limit methane, you can cap, orphaned oil and gas wells. Russia's natural gas is 2 times as high carbon emissions as that of the United States. So, these are important things to think about as we're trying to transition, and it doesn't mean that we have to just go and get rid of natural gas. And I actually get really fearful of that because I look at California, and I know there's people from California in the room, so I'm not trying to, offend those people. But California, I was touring a coal plant in Utah, and first of all, I said I was the first environmental activist that had ever been there. And I think that's a problem, because if we're trying to work with these communities on the solution or transition them to some other job, we should probably talk to them. But so I was there, and they were like, yeah, 80% of our power goes to California at night because their solar and wind isn't working. Then I started to tour natural gas facilities and nuclear facilities in Arizona. Almost all the power there goes to California during the nighttime. And 60% of the fossil fuels that California imports are from Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Colombia. So just because you shut down fossil fuels, and that now energy prices there are double the national average, just because you shut down fossil fuels, A, doesn't mean that you are reducing emissions necessarily. You might just be exporting them somewhere else. And you're raising energy prices on people that can't afford that. So we have to be able to bridge the divide between a desire of reducing carbon emissions and protecting like humanity and energy prices simultaneously. And that does not mean getting rid of fossil fuels cold turkey. I used to think that that was possible. And I know for a fact that that's not possible now, and I think most people in this room would know that too. So we have to be realistic about it. We can't throw options off the table because they're related to fossil fuels. We need to work with the industries that are having the most impact while we're still using them. If something is 70% of our energy mix right now, it's not going to zero overnight, so we might as well work with that and work with those communities instead of shooting them down. And that's why I do work with the oil and gas community, because I used to think that would be the worst thing in the world. And I now have realized that there are many people who still have the wrong approach within that community. Completely get it, and that is a problem. But there's also a lot that want to move forward in a smart way, like this company in Colorado that I toured last week. And they're capturing all the carbon at the point source. So like that's a really remarkable way to transition while we maybe don't have the reliability and affordability of these other energy sources in the same way, and how to bridge that divide.
What are some of the technologies outside of the fossil fuel industry that you're most excited about that you're seeing on your tours?
I love geothermal. I think it's really great. We need 24/7 reliable energy that's clean. And right now, hydropower, geothermal, and nuclear are the best bets. So I'm big on all of those. Obviously big on wind and solar. Really hopeful that battery storage will figure itself out, plus some of the efficiencies within panel production and everything. But those are kind of, those are all areas, like especially geothermal and nuclear, there's so much bipartisan support for right now. And I think now there's like this renaissance happening where, companies and Democrats and Republicans and everyone's kind of working together to build consensus around nuclear, which is really exciting. And that's something that I didn't know anything about before getting into the climate space. So I'm really hopeful for all those technologies. But one of the things that I tell my Republican colleagues is that we're exporting all of the clean energy development to other countries. China is building more coal plants and natural gas facilities as well, but they're also building more nuclear, more wind, more solar than any other country, because no one knows what the future of energy looks like right now. No one can predict it. And they're investing in everything, and we should be investing in everything too.
Are you hopeful about the future? You spent the past couple years, and you talked about some of the frustration from your generation, and we still find ourselves, unfortunately, in a situation where climate change is a hoax is in the discussion. So, are you hopeful about where things are headed?
I'm very hopeful, and I would say I'm hopeful because I have the privilege of going around and speaking to different communities. Like, last week I spoke at the National Offshore Oil and Gas Conference, CU Boulder, and the University of Wyoming all in 3 days. And those are three very different crowds. And people are desiring, despite the differences in opinion, very similar things. And that's actually one of the most frustrating things, honestly, about the work that I do, too, is that I feel like the disconnect at the national level is so much bigger than what actually there is on the ground. On this issue, maybe on other issues that's fair, but on this issue it's definitely overblown. And that gives me hope because I know that there's possibility here. I see Republicans buying into a lot of the ideas that people want in this room. I see it all over the country, and I see it in really, really, remarkably diverse states that you would never expect to be a part of it. And I also see Democrats who are willing to, work with Republicans on this in a way that's much more open-minded than what we hear at the national level as well. But it's also frustrating because it's like, I go back from a trip like last week and I'm feeling super inspired, and then I look at social media and I'm like, oh, geez, this is not headed in the right direction. Maybe the trick is just not checking social media. But the point is that there are millions of people aiming to divide us right now on social media and in the news media. They want us to do that because it gets them money and influence and power. And we are being really stupid as a population because the differences are actually not that stark on the ground. And so that's what gives me optimism, but it also gives me a lot of frustration. And I will say that some of the most exciting initiatives I'm seeing on climate are coming from red states and coming from really remarkably unlikely areas, lots of rural areas. And I think we're going to solve this, and it's going to be imperfect, and we can't write anything off, and we don't really know how it's going to happen. But I do have all the confidence in the world that we will avert the worst impacts of climate change and that this will be a nonpartisan issue again.
Love that. Yeah, let's get an applause for that. Let's also get an applause for Benji's socks. I mean, come on. These are,
My dad got these for me.
Honeybees are a climate solution as well.
I testified at Congress with Greta in 2019. So these are old socks. I'm outing myself. It's environmentally sustainable to have old socks. But he got them for me because they were the Lucky Bee socks.
The Lucky Bee.
So now I'm wearing them today.
I like it. Well, let's open it up for questions. Who's got a question for Benji? Let's see here. Do we have the
You got the ball
awkward
there.
cube?
Somebody launch it over. Perfect.
Yeah, go on back in the back. I think behind you with the hat.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Oh, there,
Ask one too, but
okay, you've got the block. You can ask.
Go for it.
You got all the power, man.
well, thanks, Benji. That was a great conversation between the two of you. So one thing I was really curious about is, can you name some other examples of successful depoliticization of issues in the past in U.S. politics, and how might the history of climate becoming polarized in the U.S. inform the future of how we make it a nonpartisan issue?
I love that you asked that question. It's like I planted you.
I know.
I'd never met
This is
you,
like
but
from our
I
dinner.
put you there. I love that question because that's kind of what's informing this next phase of my work with this Nature's Nonpartisan campaign. I think a really good example that's recent is gay marriage. So in the 1990s, it was like a quarter to 30% of Americans were pro-gay marriage. And even like Joe Biden and Barack Obama were against gay marriage. And there was this campaign that made it cool to be pro-gay marriage, which of course you should be pro-gay marriage. And the support for the issue doubled in the United States. And it was basically what we're trying to recreate, which is you're going to have influential Republicans and Democrats and celebrities and regular everyday people talk about why this issue is so important to them and kind of depolarize it, like kind of socialize it, normalize it, make it cool to be for something that is, pretty obvious that you should be for. And gay marriage really quickly turned from being this polarizing subject where now, you can't even be a Republican and say you're, anti-gay marriage. I mean, it's amazing how fast that turned, actually. So I think that that's a perfect example. And then we also are going to lean on the past of why environmentalism wasn't so polarizing in the past. Like I said, in the early 1990s, the vast, vast majority of Republicans and Democrats believed that the environment was a top priority. And it's because it wasn't caught up in the partisan culture wars. And so authentic messengers from both sides speaking that message, sort of like they did with gay marriage, is a really critical way to do that. So I think
marriage was also the language was a key unlock too, like the change to freedom to love who you choose. Mm-hmm. That was one of the key.
Yeah, it became pro-American to be pro-gay marriage, and I believe that, right? Like, it's a good marketing play, but it's also true, right? So I think we're going to try to do the same thing on this issue, and we'll see if it works. And maybe in 2024, 2025, the world's not ready for it, but I think we are.
Upper deck question.
Somebody's really excited to ask a question behind you.
Let's go. The excited
I think
guy.
you can jump on stage.
Have a little passion, and then we'll go upper deck after this. Upper deck. I didn't forget about you. Upper deck.
Thanks. I really just wanted to hold the box for a minute.
Aw.
No, my name's
How does it make
Ariel
you feel?
Fernandez. I'm from Taos, New Mexico. I'm a Democratic socialist who also happens to chair our Taos County Democratic Party. You can count me in on your next endeavor to help make the environment non-politicized anymore. Yep.
Also, Taos is sick.
So my question is, we all know candidates say a lot to get elected.
Yep.
Right? And at the end of the day, it's not what they say, it's who they hire to advance those policies.
Sure.
Are you in contact with members of a possible Trump next administration transition about, who's going to be in those positions, making key decisions about which climate research programs to continue funding, which climate policies to continue advancing?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the answer is yes. I speak with folks on that side of things pretty frequently, probably every week or so. We have a really good relationship with those who are likely to be the administrators if that scenario happens. And in fact, we've been holding dinners with Republican members of Congress and clean energy companies to make sure that the IRA doesn't get repealed. We are, as I started out with, this is the easiest job in the world. It's funny because people are like, Benji, you're such a grifter. You're doing this, and I'm like, believe me, this is the hardest grifting job in the entire world, if that's true. I mean, talking to Trump's transition team about climate, are you kidding me? Jesus. So yeah, we're having these conversations all the time, but a lot of the times it's about these other things, right? It's about the fact that America is falling behind the energy race globally because we're so anti-renewables. Like, being anti-wind and anti-solar is anti-America. That's our message, right? Like, you don't have to care about, yeah. And being anti-sustainable agriculture is anti-farmer, right? Like, these are things that don't just have to do with climate change, they have to do with the future of America. If you're truly America first, which I would argue sometimes he's not, that you actually would pursue a lot of these policies. And so we're having that conversation all the time.
All right, the upper deck, I promised you guys a question. What?
I was given the box, if that's okay.
How does it make you feel up there?
Hi, Benji, thank you. A big headline and tagline that came out of this summit last year, and maybe people can correct me if I get this totally wrong, but I think it was climate delay is the new denial. And to me, that narrative really says that this movement doesn't have time to stop and wait for those who aren't 100% on board with the direction that the climate agenda is going. And I was just curious if you have any thoughts or reactions to that for this group.
Great question. I would say, there's the time factor, but there's also the reality factor, which is that the biggest way to delay action is to not have conservatives as part of the table. You can't solve this problem with only half the country. That's the biggest way to delay action. You can't have action if you are removing half the country from the solutions. And I would say that I don't buy into that argument necessarily, because this is not a race towards carbon neutrality that A, like I said, is going to be easy, but B, we have a clear path on. The United States is only one country in that mix. Wyoming's only one state in that mix, and it's going to take so many different state decisions, local decisions, federal decisions for this to actually work. And especially internationally, China's emissions are rapidly increasing. India's are rapidly increasing. We don't know how we're going to get there yet. I don't try to worry about the time, because it's every time that I'm worried about the time, I'm wasting time thinking about what we should be doing about the thing. And if I worried about the time, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now. Because if we didn't have enough time, then there'd be no point in getting conservatives engaged. But there'd also be no point in even trying to solve climate change in the first place. Because this is not just an America problem. When I travel around the world, other countries are dealing with the same problem, where half the country is not part of the solution. We have to solve that challenge to meet the time demand, and that doesn't mean that all the action right away has to be substantial radical action. We just got to start taking steps, and every step is going to add up, and it's going to start to snowball. And
the market is starting to dictate that. I mean,
exactly.
Even since last year, you see, look at solar and wind and how cheap it's gotten, right? And how fast it's grown, which is even faster than most people thought.
Right. So I think we there's no way to do it without conservatives, and we have to, we can't just be okay, well, we don't have time, so we just got to write these people off. you won't solve anything if that's the approach. And I wish that wasn't the case. I wish we could just solve it as easy as a snap finger, but that's not how it is. So building the political bridge is critical, and taking small steps that add up to medium steps that add up to larger steps is the way there. We're not going to get to 2050 goals by getting there by 2025.
We have a couple more questions.
You got some more. Oh, you got a question?
Yeah, right here. Yeah.
Rip.
Check. Jessica Chambers. I'm a city councilwoman here in Jackson.
Awesome.
And so I think we have a significant chunk of people that are local electeds.
Yeah.
And we often kind of lose track of local election where I think we can make the most change. And it's often in these really unsexy areas of land use policy.
Yeah.
And so I have a question about that. Local elected officials, right there. And I mean, I would gather you talked about the political persuasions of the Sierra Club.
Yep.
I would say solidly on our council and commission, we're about 80% left. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the ranchers who tend to be on the right are not included in these discussions. And I'll just give you this little background before I ask you your thoughts on land use policy. But some of the pieces that we've put in place to protect the place have actually inadvertently not protected the place, because it's resulted in ranchers having to sell their ranches, mm-hmm. which were once wide open range. Mm-hmm. And then they were subdivided. And then you have second homeowners who have 8 boilers running to heat their driveways throughout the winter, and the range has been broken up. Yeah. And that's through our conservation policies and land use policies. Yeah. And so can you speak to that on the local level? Because I think people are, aside from the local electeds, know that the devil's in the details. I hate that term, but.
No, it's a really good point. And I also, just to get back to the ranchers and farmers thing, first of all, we do rely on farmers and ranchers and foresters for a lot of what we do. And a lot of times when I go to New York City or places, they're like, screw those people. I'm like, well, you eat their food. So, I mean, and if you get rid of them, you're dead too. So I think we have to put those people in the conversation. And I lived in Seattle for a while, like I said, and I would tell people that I was from Wisconsin, and they're like, yeah, how was that? Must have sucked. And I'm just there's this belief that middle America or people who work in these industries are just the dumbest people, or that those livelihoods suck. And so we have to get out of that mindset. I'm not saying people in here have that, but as a country, especially in urban areas. I'm a big fan of building up instead of out. I think free open space is a good thing overall. It's good for the climate, but it's also good for biodiversity. And we can't just develop the entire planet and assume, even if we fix climate change, then we'd be screwed from the biodiversity standpoint. So we have, in Seattle or any other cities, I always advocate for the building up instead of out. Consolidation in a small amount of space is a great way to do it. Obviously, it's hard in a place like this. I understand that. There's a lot of pushback against building high-rise buildings here, and I totally understand that, because that's part of what makes the charm here amazing. So I don't know what the answer is here specifically, but I do think that we need to protect the rights and the values of farmers and ranchers in this country, because also when we don't do that here, it's being done somewhere else. And right now, the Amazon is being destroyed to do food production. And yes, food production in the United States isn't perfect, but I would rather have it be done here than tear down the Amazon. And what's really sad about it is that it's so rainy there that when you take down the trees in the Amazon to do agriculture, it only works for 1 to 2 years, and then the soil and the crops just don't grow, and then you basically have deserted land. So you're tearing down the Amazon for 1 or 2 years of food production. And the United States has so much opportunity to do a lot of that. So it's a long way of saying I believe in American farming and ranching. I also believe in American wild open spaces and public land and biodiversity in this country. And I think building up instead of out is a great way to avoid a lot of that.
All right, I think we got time for one more question. Maybe over here?
Right, upper deck. Let's go. If someone's got a hot one from the upper deck. Oh, we got a hot one from the upper deck over there, maybe? I don't know. I'm seeing a finger. No, don't opt somebody in. That's rude. Okay, I see a hand over there. You wanna launch it? Or you got one?
I've got one.
Is it good? Is it a hot one?
Oh, maybe.
That's a lot of pressure.
That is a lot of pressure.
Well, look, this is a
I believe in you.
high intensity scenario. All right, let it rip. You look like you got a good question.
So I'm kind of trying to balance this idea of America First that you mentioned with the other concept of thinking globally that you've also mentioned.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think about how you reconcile that when you are speaking to maybe a more conservative population or maybe farmers, and trying to come up with solutions that are global but from a local perspective.
Really good. So the philosophy that we have is think locally and act globally. You have to think locally to act globally because it's not applicable, like I said, to put solar panels everywhere in Washington or to expect 100% of the power to be solar in a place that's super super rainy and you have all that hydropower, and so the differences in geography do matter, but the reason why you do sustainable agriculture and the reason you do it in a tailored way for a community is in a locally minded approach. But why are we doing that in general? For the global impact of fighting climate change. And so each locale is going to have its different kind of way of doing it, but it's for this global cause. But the thing is that some people might want to tap into it because of the local side of it. They love boosting the farming communities in their own area or the energy communities in their own area. They don't care about the global side. And there's people who are going to care about the global side. So the good thing about that thought process is that, again, you can bring unlikely stakeholders to the table who come at it from different perspectives. But when you have, if this approach worked and you had all, and I think it's already starting to work, if you have all the different localities thinking locally and acting globally, then it's one big push globally that's just happening in different areas around the country and around the world. And we're seeing that already. I mean, thanks to a lot of the cities and towns in this room. I mean, they're doing things in their own ways, and it's having a global impact, even though they're only doing it at the local level. And that stuff does add up, and I think that's how I think about comparing the two.
Well, Benji will be outside with his book. If you want to pick up a copy of his book, it's a really great read. And thank you for doing this. Thanks for being open to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Give it up big one more time for Benji Backer and Anna Robertson, everybody. Nice job. Nice job up there. Nice job. And Benji, let me know when you want to run for office as a Democrat. I do a great voter fraud. All right. Let's keep this thing moving. I would love to introduce the, who here had a breakfast today? Okay. Wow, you guys are on it with raising your hands. And who here ate at the tent today? Okay, that was courtesy of our next guest. Give it up big for Tori Parker, the founder of the Teton Lunch Center. Way to go.
Hi guys, how's it going? Where can I stand where the light's not?
That is the point of the stage is that you get hit with big bright lights for most of it.
Thanks everyone for letting me feed you the last couple of days. Wow, it really is bright.
I'll hang it. I'll come over here.
Oh, it's okay.
I'll shade you. There you go.
Cool. So I'll just no, don't do that. I'm really not here to talk about your meals that you ate the last couple of days, but rather the mission. Teton Lunch Counter was born about 4 years ago here in the Valley. We get 3.3 million visitors, and so many of those visitors go on day tours, as all of you know, probably living in mountain towns, whether it's a ski guide trip or going down the river for fishing, angling, or out to see the beautiful elk and the moose. And all of those meals come, and all of those trips come with meals. And so we decided to reduce tourism waste by allowing all the lunches to come in reusable containers. So of about 16 guides and outfitters, for the last 4 years, we've been able to prevent about or just over 80,000 single-use plastic containers from hitting the landfill in Teton County. Which is huge, and it's very conservative, right? So we say one meal reduces about 4 pieces of waste, but actually it's about 6 pieces of waste. And so all the guides and outfitters, they get these beautiful lunches packed. It's labeled with a guide's name. There'll be like 6 lunches, 12 lunches per guide. And, one tour operator company might have anywhere from 60 to 80 lunches that day. And then when we drop off the new meals, we pick up the old meals, we compost the rest of the food with Hatterley Farms, wash the containers, and start all over again. Chips, cookies, no single-use little packets. Everything comes in bulk, really helps us reduce our waste. So that's the waste part in the sustainability mission, but moreover, like what you guys ate for breakfast and lunch yesterday, breakfast and lunch today, all of the food is locally sourced, about 60 to 80% in season and 60% out of season. We just changed the menu in the winter. I buy like $5,000 worth of carrots from Haida Cooper Ranch in October, let it go through all the way through the spring. But yeah, we have about 18 staff. Everyone's on board about the mission to reduce waste and support the local economy. Thanks for letting me feed you, and hopefully we can keep inspiring other food cafes and catering businesses to just be really mindful and reduce your waste. And yeah, it's kind of a boots on the ground mission, and it's been really great. So stop by the cafe, it's across the street, and grab a cup of coffee. Thanks.
Big ups to Tori Parker, everybody. Great job. There you are. All righty, it is officially time for our networking break, but one sec, we're going to talk about the schedule for the rest of the day, which is right there. All right, so this is after the next session. These are the breakout rooms. Make sure you are looking and seeing which breakout rooms you want to go to. It's first come, first serve, so have a plan B. So we're going to go do a networking break, and coffee, I hope, praise God, is in the big tent back there. That's until 11 o'clock. And at 11 o'clock sharp, you have a decision to make. This is the hardest decision you're going to have to make in your entire life. It's, do you want to come back in here for the David Roberts podcast at 11? Also, sorry, that's a slightly different thing, but I will rip on this topic right here. At 6:15 tonight, the closing event is right here in the theater. We got Ari Matuziak from Rewiring America and David Roberts from the Volts podcast. That's at 6:15. They're going to have a great conversation, but at 11 o'clock, the decision that you guys are going to have to make, what I was sensing from you guys was decision fatigue, and I just wanted to tell you about a thing that wasn't a decision. This is a decision. We're back, folks, and I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this. We do have a decision. Either here at 11 is David Roberts on a podcast that is called The Evolution of the Grid in Mountain and Rural Communities. It's David Roberts, Luke Carton, and Terry Schuler. Or at 11 in the big tent, we got the Queens Lakes Visitor Economy in Carbon Zero by 2030. That's Matt Woods. Matt Woods came all the way from New Zealand. That's right. That's got to be the furthest he traveled. And the first thing I said when I saw him is, that's where they filmed The Lord of the Rings. And he said, yep. So don't say that to him, for the love of God. All right, now get to the big tent. I'll see you at 11.